we start like any good Asian with some thanks and an apology. Thanks to the Third World Study Center and Ryukoku University for having this forum and for having me to speak in this affair. I apologize also especially to our commentators for not giving you a copy of my presentation in advance. Okay, my presentation focuses on the Philippines and in particular the prospects, issues and challenges of governing international migration. Well, as far as international migration is concerned, there are several challenges. You could say these are contexts also for how we can better appreciate and respond to international migration. Well, of course, there's the challenge of responding to the sovereignty of states, and also the challenge of having to address the connections between these sovereign states. National migration policies, by virtue of their nature as migration policies, have a certain degree of ambiguity and ad hocness in the way that they are implemented, both in the sending as well as in the receiving areas. And then the other challenge, I think, has to do with how migration can be tapped for national as well as local development purposes. This is quite relatively a new thing in relation to how migration is looked upon by both sending and receiving areas. The Philippines as a whole, compared to the challenges that I have listed above, the Philippine situation is certainly no exception, and I will proceed to discuss the Philippine situation at this point. As far as migration is concerned, we're talking about a long love affair that the Philippines has had with international migration. I'll explain it in a while. Since the 1970s, we've seen a phenomenon that has become highly institutionalized in terms of the existence of agencies, rules, regulations, and programs of government to manage or to administer the migration flows. It used to be also that migration was seen as a temporary stopgap measure, but over the last 3-4 decades, we've seen this kind of stopgap measure become a permanent temporary policy on the part of government. Another thing that is peculiar about the Philippines' love affair with migration is that over the last maybe 2 decades, we've seen the government take on an uncompromising stand on protecting the rights of migrants, especially in the policy discourse, in the open policy discourse. I have enclosed the word uncompromising in quotation marks because I think there is a need to qualify this kind of position. In any case, this is a passage from the Migrant Workers Act of 1995. So as early as 1995, we have here the position taken on by the government that it does not promote overseas employment as a means to sustain economic growth and development. And that the overseas employment program rests solely on assuring the fundamental rights and freedoms of Filipinos overseas. This cannot be compromised, at least in the open policy discourse. Now, some facets of the Filipino migration flows, and I think many of you are already aware of this, that demography and development do play a significant role in these outflows. Over the years, our population has grown substantially to the point that we have relatively young population relative to the countries that are receiving migrants that have an older population, and their population growth has been declining over the years. Filipino migration flows are mainly, you can talk about corridors of migration between the Philippines and countries in East Asia, including Northeast Asia, West Asia, North America, Australia and New Zealand, and also Western Europe. So these are the main corridors of migration that we find coming from or connected with the Philippines. A substantial majority of the Filipinos that go abroad are women, largely doing largely low skilled work. HSWs stands for household service workers, or domestic workers, or domestic servants. The statistics of the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration would indicate that more and more women are leaving the country as household service workers compared to women that leave as skilled workers or managers or technicians. Another key feature of the Philippine outmigration phenomenon is the role played by the private sector, in particular the labor brokers or recruitment agencies. Over 90% of the deployments that are done from the Philippines officially are undertaken by private sector. There's also, as I pointed out in the first slide that I showed you, there's an increasing recognition now of the need to generate the potentials for migration to development, so that migration contributes to development and is not merely seen as a liability. And the whole victimization perspective, which I think will be discussed by Jean in her comments. Over the last decade, there's been in the Philippines a recognition that Filipinos overseas also need to be given certain political rights, specifically voting rights, and that's the situation right now in the Philippines. We've had overseas absentee voting for the last 3 elections. We will have the 4th election this year. But I mean, I suppose you know the situation as far as overseas absentee voting from the Philippines is concerned, which isn't really that different from the OAB situations in like Mexico or other countries. They're declining. Very few overseas voters are actually participating for so many reasons. In any case, there's the recognition on the part of the state in the Philippines to grant these overseas workers or overseas Filipinos some kind of political rights. This is I did not make this up. This is from the Commission of Audit, and it gives you a diagram of the different institutions that play a role in the whole migration phenomenon, or what their role is, and how they're connected with other institutions. doing similar roles. For example, you have the recruitment agencies right in the middle, and then Congress, and then the different government agencies like the Department of Foreign Affairs, Overseas Workers Welfare Administration, the POEA, and all that. If you can make sense of this kind of diagram, please let me know. It's very hard to really make sense about responsibilities and coordinating responsibilities between these different organizations. The Overseas Workers Welfare Administration, for example, is under the Department of Labor, the DOLE over there. But as you can see, OWA is on the right, far right, and DOLE is on the left. So there seems to be no connection between them, and yet OWA is under the Department of Labor. The same thing goes for POEA. There is something, well, this is an accurate rendering of their relationships. You know, so the problem here is in terms of how institutions actually coordinate with each other. Which brings me now to the different challenges and issues that we can make out of not only the institutional problems that were illustrated earlier in the slide, and also the facets that I talked about. There's certainly a dissonance between the program as it is being implemented, which is market determined largely, and the declared policy, which is to protect. In my view, it's very difficult to accomplish both at the same time. It's like oil and water. So you leave everything to the market, but that sacrifices their protection. You protect them, but that sacrifices the market. And yet, the declared relationship is that there should be a program that is market determined, and there should be protection for the workers. The migration management infrastructure that we have in place is primarily devoted to sending people out. If you ask institutions or agencies like POEA how many people are leaving the country at a given time, they will give you precise figures. How many in terms of gender, their occupations, where they're going, how many contracts, you know, what are the provisions in the contracts, etc. But if you ask them how many people have gone back, they will give you a blank stare. You know what? Why? Because they feel that that's not the job of a sensible government. The job of a sensible government is to send them out because they can't find jobs here. But the reality overseas is that the jobs that they take on are contractual occupations, and therefore they have a time-bound character to them, and yet the government doesn't seem to pay attention to the need to monitor their return, who returns, where they end up in, what is it that they do when they return. I'm sure when you get to visit places outside of Manila, you get to also listen to the stories of returned migrants and what has happened to them. Unfortunately, government does not, cannot provide you any precise figures on the numbers. And so we rely on NGOs, we rely on civil society organizations, and their efforts to monitor returned migrants at the local levels. As you can see in the previous slide on the diagram of the relationship between the different institutions and agencies of government and the private sector, you see that there is very little integration and coordination that takes place. leading to the intractability of the phenomenon in the way that it is being managed in quotation marks by government. You also have a problem of turfing between different agencies of government that belong to the same department. For example, the turfing that happens between the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration and the POPA, which are both under the Department of Labor. And also the turfing issues that occur between the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Commission on Filipinos Overseas, and the Department of Labor. So you can see the problems, the administrative, bureaucratic problems that confront these different organizations. This is really a challenge for any national government to try to make sense and coordinate and manage all of these different institutions and all of these mechanisms and programs that are working at the same time, operating at the same time, and yet they don't really speak to each other. You also have the absence of, despite the provision in the law, the absence of a shared government information system on migration. As early as 1995, the Migrant Workers Act provides for the establishment of this kind of shared migration information system between government agencies, but up to now, as late as last year, November, I attended a conference on this issue in the Philippines, and the report of the Philippine government was that they had only accomplished a visioning, of what this migration information system would look like. But this was this law has been there since 1995, and in 2012 they only managed to do some visioning of the system. They haven't really started anything. The other thing that is peculiar about the Philippines, but I don't know if it's really peculiar in other sending areas. The migration industry, the private sector, is largely unregulated. As I said, the policy declaration is to leave everything up to the market. There is also, as far as we in academia are concerned, there's very little coordination, or there's very little sharing of resources and information between policymakers, practitioners, and researchers. This is actually quite evident in the way that the policymakers implement or draw out their policy options. There's very little informed policy decision making that happens. Much of it is dictated by bureaucratic path dependence. So we've been doing this already, so that you really cannot deviate from this prescribed path. There's very little room for innovation. There is also the absence of any extensive or effective system to tap the remittances of migrants. I agree that these migrant remittances are individual household remittances, and therefore the migrants themselves should be given the right, they have all the right to spend their money the way they want to, but at the same time the responsibility of government is to steer, to channel those remittances towards more productive, socially more productive undertakings. The intractability also of the phenomenon of migration leads to issues about or questions about the gains that can be made from migration at the macro level. So while government is stating proudly, that over the years, in fact, you can see this in the slide next, over the years, the remittances of migrants have actually kept on increasing. And this is something that government officials are always making a statement to this effect, that they are proud of the fact that Filipinos overseas are sending back huge amounts of remittances to their families in the Philippines, and this contributes to the survival or the shoring up of the economy of the country. Okay. So as you can see, there were only a couple of times when the remittance flows experienced hiccups. No? There was a slight downturn in 95 and 98 during the regional financial crisis. But as you can see, even the global financial crisis didn't affect these remittance flows. So there's a great deal of resilience in terms of these flows. Now, the other thing that we need to take into account here is the international environment. The reality across different states and economies is that we have very few commonalities between sending and receiving areas, and there are many differences between them. There's also the existence of international conventions and norms that somehow try to put pressure on some countries that do not yet abide by such norms. And yet the issue is actually one of sovereignty between states, or rather the state sovereignty and non-intervention of states. So if one were to come up with a national migration governance or national migration management infrastructure framework for the Philippines, such infrastructure must also consider the international environment. That we cannot simply tell our neighbors that they should have bilateral agreements with us because it's the right thing to do. We cannot put pressures on these different countries precisely because sovereignty is supreme. It is still the prerogative of these states whether or not they would like to engage in such bilateral agreements or cooperative arrangements as far as migration, managing migration flows are concerned. For all we know, they might just be as content with just leaving things the way they are. That's why we have to go back to the ad hocness, the arbitrariness of such policies. I only have 2 more slides. Where do we go from here? What are the possible ways forward? Well, we need to rethink our migration management perspective towards resolving the dissonance, the intractability that we see in the system in place right now. We need to reorient the protective mechanisms that we have that are in place towards more proactive and not just reactive systems. What do I mean by that? You don't just respond to an issue when it arises. You actually try to prevent that issue from coming up. And this is when it comes to rights protection. There is a need also to formulate a stronger policy document that incorporates migration with development. The National Development Plan that we have right now, well, for some people, it's already a major accomplishment to have some kind of mention of migration in the Philippine Development Plan that we have in place. But for me, I don't think it's enough to just mention it. I think it's important to have like a chapter in the National Development Plan that actually talks about the role that migration plays in development. We need to redesign our migration management scheme to allow greater coordination between our government institutions and the private sector. We cannot just leave the private sector on its own, that they have to be also regulated. And we need to, of course, improve data collection and allow the collection of more relevant and accurate data. Not just to be collected, but also to be shared and analyzed. There is also a need to establish stronger links between migrant remittances and migrant organizations and local development. Local governments can also play a role here in the way that migrants make use of these remittances, because at the end of the day, these migrant remittances have a multiplier effect on the local situation. There is a need to provide venues for more meaningful exchanges between scholars and practitioners. For example, the governing boards of these different institutions like the OEA and OWA do not have do not incorporate inputs from the academy, have members from academy. We need to expand. Well, this is actually my my position, that there should be, I mean, one part of the reason why voting has not been as popular among overseas Filipinos is because it only incorporates nominal representation. So if we are to make them also provide for actual representation, perhaps we might see more Filipinos overseas voting. And lastly, we need to consider also strengthening the pathways towards greater regional cooperation among national authorities. And this is where I think ASEAN can play a role as well. ASEAN has already started through the charter overseas migration rather, and that can be a good start. That's it. Thank you.